We now turn to the discussion of what happened to those rock dinosaurs from the end of the 1970s. Those musicians who had their great careers in the 70s, maybe coming out of the 1960s, but now it was a new generation. MTV, young people, video, visual. These old guys are just going to crawl off into a corner and die, or go back to their castle and just sort of enjoy their retirement or whatever. Well, not so much. A lot of 70s bands continued to have great success into the 1980s. We don't focus on that much when we tell stories about the history of rock. In fact, it's fairly typical of histories of music to only follow the new innovations as they occur in every era. So if you don't know the backstory on all of this, you'd assume that when we talk about Michael Jackson and Madonna and Prince and Janet Jackson, people like that, that's all the people were listening to. But in fact, on MTV, when you were seeing those videos in the middle of the decade, you were also seeing videos by a whole host of other artists who were also having tremendous success at the same time. So the scene is a lot more varied than just following the newest innovations and newest things to come along might suggest. So I'm going to try to provide a little bit of that background of groups who had success earlier and now also had success, in some cases even more success in the 1980s than they had before. I'll first talk about the prog rock Dinosaurs. These are the guys who in the 1970s had done all of that kind of what a lot of people would think of as pretentious and overblown progressive rock music that really was totally passé by the end of the decade. These are members of groups like Genesis and Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and King Crimson. I mean, nobody could ever want to hear from these guys again in the 1980s, right? Well, as it turns out, some of them actually had more success in the 1980s, especially Genesis. In fact, trying to be funny, I suppose, I labeled a little paragraph, a series of paragraphs on Genesis in the 80s, From Genesis to Corporation, because these guys really brought it in terms of record sales in the 1980s, exceeding anything that any of them had ever seen in their wildest dreams in the 1970s. The band Genesis, now down to just 3 guys, Tony Banks on keyboards, Phil Collins on drums and lead vocals. Remember, he took over from Peter Gabriel about halfway through the 70s. And then Michael Rutherford on guitar and bass. These guys had fantastic success throughout the 80s. One hit record after another, one hit single. Maybe the best representative example of that is the 1986 album Invisible Touch, which was a number 3 record, the song Invisible Touch, a number 1 record. At the same time as all that was happening, Phil Collins was having a solo career throughout the 80s. He was a big artist in his own right. A good example of that is his 1985 album, No Jacket Required, which went to number 1, along with the 2 number 1 singles, One More Night and Susudio. The singer who had left the group in 1974, Peter Gabriel, also started to have big albums in the 1980s. He had solo albums right after he left Genesis, had a whole series of them. But the album So from 1986 went to number 2 in the charts in that year, with the number 1 hit Sledgehammer and the number 8 hit Big Time. The video to Sledgehammer is often thought of as a kind of breakthrough video because of the kind of claymation, stop-action animation that they use in it. If you've never seen it on video, you should seek it out on YouTube or wherever you go on the internet to see these videos. It's a fantastic, in its time, people were just amazed that you could do such a thing. And here's where the Michael Nesmith idea of MTV being used to kind of open up new kinds of artistic horizons really begins to take hold. We've already talked about Michael Jackson and the Thriller video. Here's Peter Gabriel with the Sledgehammer video. The Big Time video is pretty good too. You're really starting to see in the second half of the decade, MTV some of these videos start to become much more ambitious, much more interesting now than they had originally been. In addition to Genesis, Phil Collins solo, Peter Gabriel solo, the bass player, guitar player in the group, Michael Rutherford, had a group called Mike and the Mechanics, and they had a whole series of videos that were in heavy rotation on MTV, maybe the most representative of their albums being The Living Years from 1988, a number 13 album with the number 1 single on it, The Living Years. So Genesis, a very good group from the 70s. Now when they're thought of by rock historians, people focus almost entirely on the output in the 70s. In the 80s, they were major hit makers, some of the most successful artists rivaling the Madonnas and the Michael Jacksons of the world for chart success. Members of Yes came back in 1983 with the album 90125, a number 5 album for them, and their first and only ever #1 hit single, Owner of a Lonely Heart. Of course, the guys that came back with Yes were not all of the guys who'd ever been in Yes. 2 of the guys that had previously been in the band, the guitarist Steve Howe and a keyboard player named Jeff Downs, who'd also been in the Buggles, remember Video Killed the Radio Star, came back with a group called Asia, teamed with the bass player and vocalist from King Crimson, John Wetton, and the drummer from Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Carl Palmer. They released an album in 1982 simply called Asia, was #1 on the US charts for 9 weeks. Songs like Heat of the Moment, a #4 hit, and Only Time Will Tell, a #17 hit. So far from going away, these prog rockers ended up turning to a more streamlined mainstream rock sound. You could still hear the prog elements in it, but they really adapted their music to the times and had fantastic success, and in fact continued to have their videos played in heavy rotation on MTV, in addition to dominating FM rock radio during the decade. Here are some other acts from the 1970s that had great success in the 80s, and I'm just going to sort of blow through these pretty quickly just to give you a sense, give us a sense that the 80s were populated, as I said before, by groups who'd had previous success, but we don't often talk about the success they had in the 80s because we've already sort of dealt with them earlier on. But they were very much a presence and have to be figured into the picture. Foreigner, Agent Provocateur, their album, #4 album from 1984. Styx, their #3 album, Kilroy, was here from 1983. Boston, their #1 album, Third Stage, from 1986. David Bowie, his #3 album from 1983, Let's Dance. Billy Joel, his #4 album, An Innocent Man. Paul McCartney, #1 album in the pop and the UK charts in 1982, Tug of War. That's 20 years after Love Me Do. And then the Rolling Stones, 1989, the #3 album, Steel Wheels, almost 25 years after I Can't Get No Satisfaction. Well, as we look back now on the week's worth of videos and what we've talked about this week, let's review a bit of what we've been talking about. The first important point is that MTV challenged some rock values through the rise of visuals. And the questions we need to ask, you need to ask and think about, I won't give you my answers, you should develop your own, is, do the visuals overwhelm the music? Would the music itself still be interesting without the visuals? Should that matter? I mean, is it okay that music and visuals should work together in such an integral way that they cannot be separated out, right? Now, some people would say that if the music doesn't stand on its own, it's not really music. It's something else. It's some other kind of form of entertainment. But again, these are certainly debatable points, and people will have their own approaches to it. The other point to underline with regard to this MTV generation that we're talking about in the 80s is that some of the ambitious videos extend the hippie aesthetic. I spent so much time talking about this hippie aesthetic before as pulling together music from the mid-60s all the way through the 1970s. We thought that it had been eradicated and pushed back on by new wave and punk and disco, and by the time we got to the 80s, all that big sort of progressive, big ideas stuff was over with. But as videos start to become increasingly more developed, we start to see this ambition start to creep back in, and the hippie aesthetic, far from going away, kind of migrates to the video, kind of migrates to the stage show, because after people have seen these videos, they expect the stage shows to look like the videos. So the staging of a lot of these acts gets increasingly complicated to create a kind of live version of things that people have seen on the videos. The last point we should think about is, how old is too old? Earlier in this particular video, I talked about all of these groups, from some going back to the 60s, the Stones, the Beatles, Paul McCartney. Certainly many of them going back to the 70s and now in the 80s are having careers that extend beyond the usual 3 or 4 year window that a lot of groups previously had career. We're talking about somebody like Paul McCartney, the Rolling Stones, Billy Joel. These groups continue to have a career that spans decades. Used to be, I won't trust anybody over the age of 30. Now half the artists on the charts are over the age of 30. And now we look at our present time and we can say that unless something changes between now, the time I'm filming this, and the time you're watching it at some point in the future, Paul McCartney is still going strong. I mean, some 50 years after the Beatles' first successes. And so what does this mean about the history of rock music as we tell it? Rather than sort of thinking about the youth music of each generation as it comes along and that displacing the music so that we have a kind of series of new things happening every 3 or 4 years. It's more like things are beginning to stack up. So music from the 60s continues on into the 70s with those artists, and a new bunch come along, and a lot of that bunch continue on to the 80s, and a new stack comes on top of that. Sometimes people are listening to it based on what their own demographic is. So if you came in with the music of the 60s, you follow those groups but basically ignore some of the others. If you came in the 70s, you follow those groups and ignore the others. But sometimes as we get to the present day, we've got people, young people, who are discovering 60s and 70s music as if it was their own music. We have this accumulation of historical music in the history of rock that's now starting to look more like a repertory, than a hit parade. And I can say that we already start to see that at the end of the 1970s, but in the 80s, with the presence of so many different sort of generations of musicians on the charts, on MTV at the same time, we're really starting to see the rock tradition, the rock history, the rock repertory begin to take on a kind of multi-decade kind of complexion, going all the way back to the music of going all the way back to the music of Elvis in the 1950s. We'll talk about that in the last video, what happens with the sort of historicization of rock music and rock music history, the kind of thing that would lead to us even having a class like the one that you're watching now. For now, let's look forward to next week. We'll talk about the rise of heavy metal, rap, and alternative rock. See you then.